everyone. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Hello, everyone. Okay, that's cool. I know it's late on a Thursday, day 2, and the energy might be sagging a little bit, but it's okay. You're here. You've got this. So, refactor yourself. What do you want to be when you grow up? Do you remember being asked that question as a kid? What was your response? Because for me, I never knew the answer to that question. There were so many potential cool jobs out there. How could I ever pick out that one single thing that I do for the rest of my life? Because that's how it worked, right? You picked a job and you stuck with it until you retired. At least that's what my dad and mum did. So throughout my childhood, I jumped between a variety of professions that I wanted to be, from forensic scientist to movie director, from writer to rocket scientist. I had so many different ideas and dreams of what I wanted to be. So skip forward to 10 years later. I'm 18 and I'm studying computer science. Now at this point, I've made up my mind that I want to be a developer. I don't quite yet know what language or area I want to focus in, but I'm sure that once I'm graduated, my main focus will be on programming. I thought that the primary thing that I would do day to day is write code. Skip forward to now, and in the past 20 years, I've been an engineer, an event organizer, a blogger, a conference speaker, an engineering manager, a speaker coach, a workshop trainer, and a consultant. Over the years, I've pushed myself to try out different things and learn who it is that I want to be. I've slowly come to realize what it is that I am actually good at and what I enjoy doing. So, hello to everyone here in the room. My name is Melinda Seckington. I live in London, in the UK, but I'm originally Dutch, Indonesian, and Australian. It's complicated. I run my own company, Learn, Build, Share, where I help engineers and engineering teams through one-on-one coaching, workshops, and training. So I used to be an engineer and an engineering manager at companies like FutureLearn and the Wikimedia Foundation. And now I get to share what I know, and I help others improve their speaking, communication, and management skills. So I've loved helping people figure out what they want to get better at and how they can change and evolve their careers. And that's so true with the current climate today. We are in an industry where things are always changing, where there are redundancies and layoffs and strategy changes and team moves. We live in a time where we most likely won't just have that one single career, that one thing that you do for the rest of your life. And maybe you're sitting here listening to me and thinking, but Melinda, I know I'll be a developer for the rest of my life. I won't need another career, another role. And that might be true for you. But consider this. Do you think that you'll be using the same programming language or the same tools 5 years from now? What about 10 years? What about 20 years? Especially with things like AI on the rise, our roles will change whether or not we want it. So the number one thing that we need to learn is how to adapt. We need to figure out what it is that we like to do to help us understand what our next role, our next career, our next technology, our next tools, our next languages will be. Because no matter what happens, things are going to change and we need to change with it. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that we're actively changing and adapting what we want to do? Now, when I was figuring this out for myself, I realized I didn't need to look that far for inspiration. There are already things that I have been doing on a daily basis within the engineering teams that I worked at that I could apply to myself. I was already learning these ways to adapt and change. So I've worked most of my career in teams where we make sure we have the time to refactor our code and make it cleaner and easier to use, where we stop and look at what we've written and take time to make improvements. And we can apply those same principles to ourselves. So that's why I want to talk today about refactoring, just not in the way that you might have thought of before. So basically to stop and think about how we can improve ourselves and our behaviors. Because if we don't, we risk creating the human equivalent of technical debt. Waking up one day and realizing that you don't really like the person that you've become, or wishing that you had focused on different skills, different passions, different goals. So this talk is about how to change our behaviors, how to really look at what you do and understand what levers you can pull to improve how you do things and help you become the person that you want to be. So first, we need to ask ourselves, what behaviors do we actually want to change? How do we know what to focus on? So the first step is to take time to reflect on what to change, to figure out how you want to improve or better yourself. So who do you want to be? And in a way, most of us are doing some form of reflection already, but we already have these kind of brief moments of introspection where we think about what we want for life. But for me, at least, these happen when we're commuting, or during breakfast or lunch, when I'm getting ready for work, when I'm exercising. They tend to happen at these moments when you don't really have to think about anything else, when we have enough spare brain power to just let our minds wander and think about what if. And only doing it during these moments of when we're actually doing other things, it's not enough for most of us. So make time for active, actual reflection. You need to spend time looking at yourself to understand yourself. And the best way to do that is through doing personal retrospectives. So this is explicit time in my calendar where all my focus is on reflecting. Now, some of you may be familiar with doing retrospectives with your team, but not many people take time to do this for just themselves. And if you were in Martin's talk this morning, he actually covered some of this as well and gave a good example of how to set up a retrospective for you. And there are lots of different formats that you can use for your retrospectives, but today I'm just focusing on a variation that is aimed at looking at your behaviors. So this type of retrospective is all about examining recent events. So think back about what you've done recently and what you want to change. So examine a shorter period, and this, again, really depends on you. So some people will want to do this every day. For others, once a month is enough. But figure out a regular pattern of when you want to do these and stick to that pattern. So for me, I do this every 2 weeks. Start the retrospective with celebrating what you've achieved. It's very easy to focus on all the things that we could have done, that we want to do differently, but you need to start with celebrating the things that you have done. And this will also help you identify what behaviors you have that you want to keep, that you're happy with. And then learn from what you've done. What are the things that you do differently if you had a chance? What behaviors do you want to change? Now, a typical team retrospective will ask quite contained questions. I don't know why. Sorry? Okay, there we go. So, where was I? So a typical team retrospective will ask these quite contained questions. So for instance, focusing on what went well, what went less well, what confused us. Again, there are variations depending on the type of retro that you use, but they do tend to be kept to these quite confined areas, mainly because there are more people involved and you want some structure and facilitation in how you discuss things that come up during those team retrospectives. In the case of your own personal retrospectives, though, I feel like that structure doesn't really matter as much. You have time to explore more. So the questions act more like prompts to just get you thinking about the right type of stuff. So what I like to do is to create as many questions as I can to answer. All of these are different prompts to get my mind thinking about all the things that happened in the past 2 weeks. Now, some of these questions you might not answer in a particular week. It's all just there to help you think about the things that are really important to you in that specific retro. And you can constantly add new questions to the list. Try to recognize what type of questions get you thinking about what you want to do differently. Because this is all about creating a set of questions that help you, not anyone else, just you. And then based on these questions, think about, well, okay, what do I then need to change? I then also take time to reflect on my values. So what are your personal values? How would you define those? If someone had to describe you in a few words, which words would you want those to be? And these values don't necessarily need to be things that you're doing yet, but they need to be ones that mean something to you. So I would ask myself questions that are directly related to the values that I care about. Did I do anything that was specifically courageous this week? Was there something that I could have been more efficient at? So the useful thing of these values is that because they are the things that I care about, chances are that when things don't happen in this way, I want to change it. I want to change my behaviors around it. And finally, I also take time to think about my goals. What am I trying to achieve? How am I progressing with my goals? And then what do I need to do differently to actually achieve those goals? And maybe you don't have goal sets, so take this also as an opportunity to define these and think about, okay, how do you want to grow? Where do you want to be in a few years' time? And then using the answers to all of these prompts, take some time to reflect on your current behaviors. What behaviors do you want to change? And what behaviors do you want to keep? Let's say you do this retrospective next Monday when you're back at work, and you ask yourself, what did I learn these 3 days at this conference? Only thinking about those learnings isn't enough. You need to take what you learned and put it into actual practice. So how do you want to embed what you've learned here in your day-to-day? So, first lesson, reflect in a retrospective and then put time aside to go through the prompts that work for you. And then once you've done the reflection, think about what behaviors you want to change. What do you need to be doing differently? So you want to create a list of behaviors that you like and the behaviors that you'd like to change. Now, once you have these, then we need to figure out, well, how do we actually change these behaviors? So for that, let's look at what we do when we refactor our code. So first, why do we refactor our code? So I think the main reason is to avoid technical debt, to avoid the code getting into such a bad state that we can't work effectively with it anymore. So flipping it around and being a little less pessimistic, it's about keeping the code base in a good state and improving its internal design while not changing any behavior. It's about keeping it in a healthy enough state so that we can do the following. So first, ensuring that it stays maintainable so that it's easy to fix and change things. And then two, ensuring that it stays extensible so that it's easy to add new things. And typically the refactoring goes like this. There's a code smell, something that tells me the code isn't quite the nicest way of doing things, that there's something here that I could improve on. I then go and refactor it, changing the thing that I want to change. And finally, I'll normally have tests or something in place to make sure that the changes I made didn't break anything. That externally, the system still behaves as it does. Something that tells me, yay, that thing I did was great, it was good, we didn't break anything. It's this iterative cycle of constantly making sure that the code we have is improving. So how do we extend the same logic to us? Why should we refactor ourselves? In this case, it's about improving the way that we do things. So ensuring that it's easy to change existing behaviors or skills, and ensuring that it's easy to add new behaviors or skills. So the main question to ask here is, how do we make it easier to do all this? And for this, again, we can get inspiration from how we refactor code. So going back to our code refactoring example, this is very much focused on code, but we can generalize it. So first, there's a sign that we need to do something. There's something that tells us, look, you need to stop and take a look at this thing. Then you can actually go do that thing. And then finally, you can celebrate. And now this loop, this is what is called a habit loop. And understanding how the habit loop works and how you can recognize it and apply it to yourself is one of the things that I think can help people achieve their goals and change their behaviors. So most of what I'll be talking about comes from this book, The Power of Habit, from Charles Duhigg. As the title says, it's all about habits. It doesn't just look at habits of individuals, but also the habits of teams, organizations, and societies. And I think when people hear the term habits, they immediately think of things like exercising more, or eating healthier, or waking up earlier. And I'll use some of these as examples later on, but there are things that you can do in your jobs that are ingrained in you that are habits as well. Habits are your behaviors, your daily routines, your default responses. And understanding habits is useful from a professional point of view. So this is pretty much the habit loop that we saw before, only with a little bit more proper terminology. So first, you have the cue, that sign or trigger that we need to do something. Then there's the routine, the behavior or thing that you want to do. And then finally, there's the reward, that moment to celebrate that you've actually done something. Now, I love this quote from the book. Over time, this loop, cue, routine, reward becomes more and more automatic. The cue and reward become intertwined until a powerful sense of anticipation and craving emerges. So what this means is that if you design these habit loops well, you create habits and routines that are really powerful, habits and behaviors that stick with you, that you want to do. And when you learn how habit loops work and understand their structure, it becomes easier to control them. Once you break down a loop into all these components, the cue, the routine, and the reward, you can basically fiddle with each part and make them properly work for you. So if you want to change certain behaviors, it's worth designing a habit loop around them. Really understanding what the cue, the routine, the reward is, so that you can make it more compelling to change. And there's a lot of research and frameworks out there about habit building. And so this isn't the only one that's out there. And it does oversimplify how habits work. But because this habit loop concept is easy to understand, it's a useful method for us to just start thinking about our behaviors and recognizing ways that we can improve ourselves. Now, I should also mention here that I believe that every single goal that you have can be mapped to specific habits. Let's say you have a goal to get a promotion. What do you need to do to achieve that promotion? Most probably, you need to exhibit a certain set of behaviors that you're not doing yet, like pairing with more junior people on the team, for instance. So what would you need to do to pair with more people? It's going to be getting into a habit of asking who wants to pair, for instance. So a new habit could be to ask every day at stand-up who wants to pair. Or maybe you have a goal to complete a training course or read a book or complete a certification. How are you making time for doing that? What's your habit to making progress in that goal? So if you want to achieve your goals and you're currently not, it's your habits and behaviors that you need to change. So let's look at some ways to design our habit loops. So I think there are 4 ways of how we can use this idea of a habit loop to change our behaviors. Now, often when we talk about creating new habits, we talk about the last one in this list, a habit where all parts of the habit loop are new. And these are actually the trickiest type of habits to create. Now, sometimes that's the only way that we can add a new habit, but I find in most cases we can actually use one of these other methods, making it easier to embed a habit. So I'll explain what I mean with each of these and give examples on how to apply these. So first, build on existing loops. So this is about recognizing what habit loops you already have and adapting them to include another element. So you add an additional part to either the cue, the routine, or the reward. So I like to see this as piggybacking on existing habits. So let's take a look at a very simple example first. The advice that dentists give to get people flossing more. It's a boring example, but it's very simple. So you maybe already have this habit of brushing your teeth. If you don't, maybe you need to start there first, but I'm assuming you do. Now, you already have this loop that you're already going through daily, and it's not that tricky to add flossing to it as well. So the entire habit loop remains the same, only with this little addition to our routine. Here's another example, finding time for learning during work hours. So one of the people I used to manage was struggling to put time aside for personal development. In his case, he wanted to read a book and had put a slot in his calendar to do this once a week. So this was the habit loop that he wanted to happen. His cue was a calendar reminder to stop and read. His routine would be the actual reading, and his reward was that fact that he got to learn something. This loop, though, it didn't really work. So each time that calendar reminder would come up, he'd be in the middle of implementing something and didn't really feel like he could just put that aside to go and read something. So what we realized is that he already had this existing habit loop. He'd pick up a new feature, he'd work on the feature, and then ship the feature. And his reading time would be in the middle of his existing routine of trying to finish his work, and was something that he could easily dismiss and not do. So he tried to create this completely new habit, but his old, more ingrained habit was taking priority. So after talking about it with me, he ended up changing his existing loop. So each time he shipped something, he would celebrate that with some reading. So that way he didn't interrupt the loop that he already had, but extended it with an additional reward. So, what are your existing habit loops? What are the behaviors that you already keep doing? And then which one of them could you adapt? Which ones could you piggyback on so that you can embed a new habit? So the next type that we're looking at is replacing part of the loop. So here you need to replace one element of the loop. So you change either the cue, the routine, or the reward. So we'll take a look at examples again for each of these. So this you want to use when you have existing habits that are not quite working, that for some reason or other are just not happening. So first, let's look at changing the cue with this example of how to stop meetings from overrunning. So here's a loop that should happen at the end of a meeting for me. I see what time it is, I stop the meeting, and I'm on time for my next meeting. But this loop relies on a cue where I actively need to be looking at the time, and maybe you're great at doing that. I am not. This habit loop is reliant on that first thing, that cue actually happening. And if it doesn't, the whole thing fails. So I changed it so that I'd get a notification that the meeting was done. Something that would tell me, yep, it's time, rather than having to rely on me looking at something. So in this case, the habit loop wasn't working properly because that cue wasn't working for me. I had to replace the cue with something different for that entire loop to work in the way that it should. Here's an example for changing the routine part. So one of the things I do is I help new managers learn skills that they need, and one of them is helping them get into that coaching mindset. So typically as engineers, when someone asks us for help, we immediately go into advice mode. We try to solve the problem for other people. But if you're a manager, or even if you're more senior and want to help others think more for themselves, rather than give them the answer, you want to learn how to coach them so that they can get to the answer themselves. So it's building a new routine, a new default response when someone asks you for help. So rather than give advice, you ask a question and shut up. So Martin actually talked about this yesterday and looked at the different types of questions that you could be asking. You might need to continue asking them questions and getting deeper into the problem. But the main gist of this is that you need to stop giving advice and ask questions instead. Then the third part of the loop that we can replace is the reward. Now, who here likes doing the laundry? A few people, okay. I'm not one of them. I don't think it's a particularly fun task, I'd say. We notice that the laundry basket is full, we then throw in a wash, and then the reward is nice and clean laundry. Now, for a lot of regular habits, the loop is fairly simple, but also not quite that appealing. It's kind of dry and boring. So I'm going to admit, yeah, I dislike doing the laundry, and I'll leave it most of the time until my husband does it. So I need some extra motivation to kind of build up that habit to make me want to do this. And I think that's true for a lot of habits. So think about, what reward can you give yourself that makes this habit compelling? Maybe it's something more tangible, like having a special snack, a chocolate or so, or getting to play a video game. Think about what reward you can give yourself that makes you want to do this. Now, throughout my examples, I'll use different types of rewards. Some of them intrinsic, some more tangible. But think about what you need. What does the reward need to be for you to make the loop as compelling as possible? You want to turn these loops into something that you kind of crave, that you want to do. And for that, the reward needs to make sense for you. My types of rewards might not work for you. So think about what those rewards could be. Now, sometimes you might want to start off with one type of reward, something tangible, and through the process of doing the habit, you discover something else, something intrinsic that is your reward. Or maybe that intrinsic feeling of completing it is enough. For instance, I used to be terrified of public speaking, and whenever I traveled abroad to give a new conference talk, my reward would be a fancy new lipstick for myself. I like my red lipsticks. I've got a lot of them by now. After a while, though, I got over my anxiety and I looked forward to giving talks in the first place. Like the rush and adrenaline of being on stage was actually its own reward. Plus, my lipstick collection had gotten way too large and it wasn't really good. So changing the reward is a great way to make a habit stick, to make it embedded. So that's, yeah. So again, what are your existing habit loops? What are the behaviors that you keep on doing? And then which elements are just currently not working? What are the loops that just don't work right now? And in a way, you could think about this in ways of what is it that you want to change? And then experiment with how to fix it. Do you need to change the cue, the routine itself, or the reward? And don't be afraid to try different things here. This is also why doing those regular personal retrospectives is so useful, because you can keep reflecting and then adapting and noticing which behaviors work and which you need to change up. So the third way of changing our habit loops is creating a new loop with an existing cue. So in this case, we want a cue that doesn't have an associated loop connected to it. So a while back, I had this goal of wanting to change the state of mind that I had before going to bed. Basically just trying to disconnect from everything and relax a bit more rather than looking at my phone and just doom scrolling all the time. I can see some nods here. Yeah, doom scrolling is one of those habits that we don't want to do. So previously, the cue of actually just going to bed wasn't really associated to any specific habit. Now I've changed it so that whenever I go to bed, no matter how late it is or how busy it is, I'll read a book for about 30 minutes, or at least until I fall asleep and drop the book on my head, which happens more regularly than I like to admit. So it's inserting a new routine into a specific moment of the day. Another example of this is how I push myself to overcome some of my fears. I noticed at a certain point that I was very often saying no whenever people asked me something that I was scared of doing. And I realized I could use that as a cue. So one summer, I forced myself to say yes to anything that came my way. And this turned saying yes into a routine, into something that I didn't even have to think about. It removed the option of saying no. Because no matter what, I had to say it. Because of this, I ended up doing my first conference talk, I appeared in a live coding video, and I experienced a sinking ship simulator, and I now know what to do if a submarine hull breaches. Not sure when that skill will come in handy, but who knows. So if you want to have a more tangible reward, though, you could also replace it with something that allows you to celebrate. So something like, again, eating cake, buying a new book, treating yourself to a spa. It needs to be, again, something special that makes it easier for you to stick to that routine. So start with identifying what cues you already have. What are the things that happen to you regularly? So initially, just write down a list of everything that you can think of, but be specific. So stuff like turning off your alarm in the morning, grabbing a tea or a coffee, a pull request coming in, a teammate coming to you for advice. Think about your daily schedule, like catch-ups with specific people, daily stand-ups, planning meetings. What are the existing things in your day-to-day that you could use as a cue for something else? And these things don't even have to be related. Sometimes the best habits you can form by adding a routine to something completely random, but it happens every day. And then think about which of these could you extend to embed that new routine. Now for the final one. And this is the most tricky type of habit loop to start, because you're relying on all three parts to be completely new. So first example is how to get yourself exercising more. So one of the more common tips that I hear is when you want to start exercising is take out your running gear, put it somewhere so that you can see it first thing in the morning. The thing is, I tried it and it doesn't really work for me. I see the stack of clothes, I look at it and go, yeah, I should go, but I'm nice and warm in my bed. I don't really want to leave. So I didn't do it. What really helped for me was when I started playing the game Zombies Run. It's a mobile game where you are Runner 5, a survivor of the zombie apocalypse. And during your runs, you basically listen to a story slowly unfolding about your character while also having to run away from zombies. So it's more like a TV show, actually, than a game, because you slowly hear the story unfold. So all three parts of this loop are completely new: the cue, the routine, and the reward. But the thing is, this loop is actually something that I should have realized would work for me. I have always loved binge-watching TV shows, even before the phrase binge-watching became a thing. I know I can get extremely addicted to stories. And realizing that, I now know that I can use this for building habits in the future. So final example is removing stop words during a talk. So lots of people get so nervous during their talks that they try to fill all the silences. It's a really common reaction. Your mind thinks you have to say something and you just end up going or It's a hard thing to stop doing. So one technique that I teach when I help new speakers is to create a new habit loop. Something that you can pay attention to while you're presenting. So here's a loop. When you finish a sentence, you pause and take a breath. And the reward is that it allows me to refocus and calm down. But most of all, it gives you something explicit to do instead of automatically filling the silence with ums. It's a new habit loop because previously the cue was not something that you'd pay attention to. It's about creating a new moment of awareness and then turning it into a habit. And it takes time, but this is one of the best ways to help remove these type of stop words. So when creating new habit loops, think about all three aspects: the cue, the routine, and the reward. And then come up with the best combination that works for you. And then iterate on these habit loops. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out which cue and which reward actually works best for you. So we've got 4 different ways to create habit loops. Build on existing loops, replace part of the loop, create a new loop with an existing cue, and then find new cues and new rewards. So, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't think you ever really need to know the answer to that question. But whatever you do, you should always be thinking, how are you changing? You need to give yourself the space and time to figure that out and constantly adapt and change the way that you do things. Think about what behaviors you can improve to turn yourself into a better, more efficient, more compassionate, a kinder you. So one final task for all of you. Tomorrow or later this week, whenever you get back properly to work, don't just get straight back to work. Make some time to just stop and think about all the different things that you've been learning and hearing about these 3 amazing days. Think about what's next for you. Because if there's one thing that I've learned, is that all of us are able to do so much more than we initially believe about ourselves. You can do anything that you want to. You just have to know what that anything is for you, and then make that change happen. And I hope that with today's talk, you're just one step closer to being able to refactor yourself and become the person that you want to be. So if you want to find out more about what I do, you can check out my website, seckington.com, or follow me on LinkedIn through the QR code there. Thank you all so much for listening.